Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history, Long Island, New York. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. 113 Ocean Avenue stands like any other house along the coastal stretch of Babylon, Long Island. 2 stories of weathered clapboard siding, a modest front porch, and windows that reflect the Atlantic's gray waters just beyond the dunes. But on November 13, 1952, this unremarkable residence became the center of what investigators would later describe as one of the most psychologically disturbing cases ever documented in Nassau County records. The house itself bore no external signs of the horror that had unfolded within its walls for nearly 2 decades. Yet something about the central staircase connecting the first and second floors had driven 3 separate families to abandon the property, each leaving behind personal belongings and never returning to collect them. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not what was found within the walls of this ordinary Long Island residence, but rather what continues to remain hidden. Despite decades of investigation by local authorities, psychiatric professionals, and architectural specialists who have attempted to explain the psychological deterioration that befell every individual who spent extended periods within the structure. The story begins not with the events of November 13th, but rather with the Kellerman family, who first occupied the residence in 1934. Harold Kellerman, a dock worker at the Babylon Harbor, had purchased the property with savings accumulated over 15 years of steady employment. His wife, Margaret, kept house and maintained a small garden behind the residence. The couple had lived quietly for 18 years, attending Sunday services at St. Joseph's Catholic Church and maintaining cordial relationships with neighbors along Ocean Avenue. Harold was described by co-workers as methodical in his habits, arriving at the docks each morning at precisely 6:15 and returning home each evening by 5:30. Margaret rarely ventured beyond the local grocery store and post office, though neighbors recalled her as polite when encountered on her daily walks to collect mail. The Kellermans represented the ideal of quiet domestic stability that characterized many Long Island communities during the post-war period, when returning veterans sought peaceful suburban environments where they could establish families and pursue modest but comfortable lifestyles away from the urban chaos of nearby Manhattan. The Kellermans had established what appeared to be a peaceful domestic routine that neighbors could set their watches by. Harold would climb the central staircase each evening at 9 o'clock to prepare for sleep. Margaret would follow precisely 30 minutes later after completing her kitchen duties and ensuring all ground-floor windows and doors were secured. This pattern continued without variation for over 17 years. Neighbors noted the consistency of lights appearing in the second-floor windows at 9:15 each evening, followed by complete darkness by 10 o'clock. The regularity of this schedule became a reliable timepiece for other residents along Ocean Avenue, who often synchronized their own evening activities with the Kellerman household's predictable rhythm. Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, who resided directly next door at 111 Ocean Avenue, later told investigators that she had grown so accustomed to the Kellerman's evening routine that she would become concerned if the upstairs lights appeared even 5 minutes late, wondering if Margaret had perhaps fallen ill or encountered some minor domestic crisis that had delayed her normal schedule. During the early morning hours of March 22, 1952, Mrs. Hastings was awakened by sounds that she initially attributed to spring storms moving in from the Atlantic. However, as she lay listening in her darkened bedroom, she realized that the noises were coming specifically from the Kellerman residence next door, rather than from the natural settling and creaking that old houses typically produce during changes in weather and temperature. What she heard was the unmistakable sound of heavy furniture being moved repeatedly across wooden floors, accompanied by what seemed to be footsteps moving up and down the central staircase with unusual frequency and urgency. The sounds continued intermittently from approximately 2:30 until 4:15 in the morning, long after any reasonable explanation for household activity could account for such disturbances. Mrs. Hastings later told police that she had never previously heard any noise from her neighbors after 10 o'clock in the evening, not even during holidays or special occasions when guests might have been present. The intensity and duration of the sounds were unlike anything that could be explained by normal domestic activity, yet they seemed to originate from areas of the house where the Kellermans would typically be sleeping peacefully. The following morning brought an eerie silence that Mrs. Hastings found even more disturbing than the previous night's unusual sounds. Harold failed to appear for his customary departure to the docks at 6:15, and Margaret's morning routine of hanging laundry and tending to her garden did not occur as expected. By noon, Mrs. Hastings had grown sufficiently concerned to walk across her yard and knock on the front door of 113 Ocean Avenue, hoping to verify that her neighbors were simply experiencing a minor illness or family matter that had temporarily disrupted their normal schedule. When her knocking received no response, she attempted to peer through the ground floor windows, but the curtains remained drawn and no movement could be detected within the residence. Harold failed to report for his shift at the docks, marking the first absence in his employment record spanning over 15 years. His supervisor, Thomas McMahon, contacted the residence by telephone several times throughout the day but received no answer. This absence was particularly concerning because Harold had never failed to notify his supervisor in advance of any planned absence, even for medical appointments or family emergencies. By March 24th, concerned neighbors had contacted the Babylon Police Department to request a welfare check. Officer Thomas McKenna and Officer Robert Donnelly arrived at 113 Ocean Avenue at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, expecting to find a straightforward explanation for the Kellermans' temporary absence from their normal routine. They found the front door unlocked, which was unusual for a couple who were known to be cautious about home security. The ground floor of the residence appeared to be in perfect order, with all furniture remaining in its proper position, dishes cleaned and stored, and Margaret's coat hanging on its usual hook beside the entrance. However, both officers noted an unusual odor throughout the house, which they initially attributed to poor ventilation during the early spring season when windows typically remained closed against the cold Atlantic winds. The smell was not immediately identifiable as anything specific, but both men later described it as somehow wrong for a residence where people had been living normally just days earlier. Officer McKenna climbed the central staircase to investigate the second floor, while Officer Donnelly remained on the ground level to examine the kitchen and living areas more thoroughly. McKenna's incident report, filed later that afternoon, contains a notation that the wooden steps creaked excessively under his weight, despite appearing structurally sound. The sound was not merely the normal settling that old wooden stairs typically produce, but rather a prolonged groaning noise that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves, as though the structure was responding to stress in ways that exceeded normal architectural expectations. The second floor revealed no immediate signs of disturbance. The Kellermans' bedroom showed evidence of recent occupancy, with the bed unmade and Harold's work clothes draped over a chair. A window facing the Atlantic remained open, allowing cold March air to circulate through the upper level and contributing to the unusual odor that seemed to permeate the entire residence. Most significantly, Officer McKenna discovered that a section of the staircase's interior wall showed signs of recent repair work. Fresh plaster covered what appeared to be a rectangular opening approximately 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, located beneath the 7th step from the bottom. The plaster work appeared to have been completed hastily, with visible tool marks and uneven application that suggested non-professional workmanship. When McKenna examined the repair more closely, he noticed that the plaster remained slightly soft, indicating that the work had been completed very recently, possibly within the previous few days. This timing coincided with the period during which Mrs. Hastings had reported hearing unusual sounds from within the residence. The location of the repair work beneath the central staircase in an area that would not normally require maintenance raised immediate questions about why Harold would have chosen to work on this particular section of wall and what he might have discovered that required immediate sealing. The Kellermans were never located, despite an extensive investigation conducted by Nassau County authorities throughout the spring and summer of 1952. Their personal belongings remained untouched in the residence, including Margaret's jewelry, Harold's savings bonds, and family photographs dating back several decades. Bank records indicated no recent financial transactions, and Harold's employer confirmed he had given no advance notice of resignation or extended absence. The couple's automobile remained parked in the small garage behind the residence, eliminating the possibility that they had chosen to travel voluntarily to another location. Interviews with extended family members in nearby communities revealed that neither Harold nor Margaret had made contact with relatives or indicated any intention to leave their Ocean Avenue residence. The case was classified as a missing persons investigation, though no evidence suggested foul play or voluntary departure. Most puzzling to investigators was the condition of the central staircase and the recently sealed wall section. Examination by a county building inspector revealed that the recently plastered section of wall concealed a hollow space within the staircase's interior framework. Yet no work permits had been filed with local authorities, and no residents of Ocean Avenue recalled seeing workers at the property during the period when the repair work would have been completed. Following standard procedures for abandoned properties, the residence was sealed pending resolution of the missing persons case. However, the property remained under county supervision for only 6 weeks, as distant relatives of Harold Kellerman arrived from Albany to claim the residence and its contents. On May 8, 1952, William Kellerman, identified as Harold's cousin, and his wife Dorothy, provided legal documentation establishing their right to inherit the property in the absence of direct heirs or a valid will. The documentation had been prepared by an Albany law firm and appeared to be entirely legitimate, though investigators noted that William and Dorothy seemed unusually eager to take possession of the property despite the unexplained circumstances surrounding Harold and Margaret's disappearance. The Nassau County authorities released the property to their custody on May 15, 1952, exactly 8 weeks after the initial welfare check, though several officials privately expressed concern about allowing new occupants to move into a residence where the previous inhabitants had vanished under such mysterious circumstances. William and Dorothy Kellerman moved into 113 Ocean Avenue on May 22, 1952. William had recently retired from his position as a bookkeeper for a textile manufacturing company in Albany, and the couple had been seeking a residence near the ocean where they could enjoy a peaceful retirement. Dorothy was described by neighbors as a nervous woman who spoke little and avoided extended conversations, particularly when questioned about their relationship to Harold and Margaret, or their knowledge of the circumstances surrounding the previous occupant's disappearance. The couple brought minimal personal belongings, choosing to utilize the furniture and household items left by Harold and Margaret. This decision struck neighbors as somewhat unusual, given that most people would prefer to use their own familiar belongings when establishing residence in a new location. However, William explained to those who inquired that they had sold most of their possessions in Albany and found the existing furnishings to be of good quality and suitable for their needs. The second family's occupancy of the residence lasted exactly 5 months and 11 days. during which time their behavior patterns became increasingly erratic in ways that concerned nearby residents. Unlike the previous occupants, William and Dorothy rarely used the central staircase during evening hours. Mrs. Hastings noted that lights appeared only on the ground floor after sunset, despite the couple clearly sleeping on the second level of the residence. When questioned about this discrepancy, Dorothy explained that they preferred to climb the stairs only once each day, retiring for sleep immediately after ascending to avoid multiple trips on the steep wooden steps. This explanation seemed reasonable initially, but Mrs. Hastings began to notice that the couple would sometimes remain awake on the ground floor until very late hours, sitting in darkness rather than ascending to their bedroom at a reasonable time. On several occasions she observed them standing at the bottom of the central staircase for extended periods, appearing to listen intently to something that she could not hear from her position next door. During the summer months, Dorothy's behavior became increasingly unusual in ways that disturbed neighbors and local shopkeepers. She began making frequent purchases at the local hardware store, buying materials such as wooden boards, nails, plaster, and various hand tools. When asked about these purchases, she would provide vague explanations about home maintenance projects, but neighbors observed no evidence of any work being performed on the exterior of the residence. The materials would be carried into the house and never seen again, leading Mrs. Hastings and other nearby residents to wonder what projects William and Dorothy were undertaking inside the residence that would require such extensive supplies. Additionally, Dorothy began asking strange questions during her trips to the grocery store and post office, inquiring about the history of Ocean Avenue and whether any other residents had experienced unusual sounds or disturbances in their homes. These questions made local merchants uncomfortable, particularly when Dorothy would persist in asking for specific details about neighbors' experiences with unexplained noises or structural problems. On October 31, 1952, Mrs. Hastings was again awakened during the early morning hours by sounds originating from 113 Ocean Avenue. This time, the disturbances were markedly different from the furniture-moving sound she had reported in March. What she heard resembled scratching or clawing sounds, as though something was attempting to break through wood or plaster from inside the wall structure itself. The sounds appeared to originate specifically from the central staircase area and continued intermittently throughout the night, sometimes stopping for periods of 30 to 40 minutes before resuming with increased intensity. Mrs. Hastings later told police that the scratching sounds seemed to follow a pattern, with periods of frantic activity followed by intervals of complete silence, as though whatever was producing the sounds was pausing to listen for responses or reactions from elsewhere in the house. Most disturbing was her impression that the sounds were being produced by something trapped within the walls, desperately attempting to break free from confinement. Police response was delayed until the following afternoon due to Halloween celebrations requiring additional patrols throughout the township to manage increased juvenile activity and pranks that typically occurred during this holiday. When officers McKenna and Donnelly arrived at 113 Ocean Avenue on November 1st, they discovered the residence completely abandoned. William and Dorothy Kellerman's automobile was missing from the property, and their personal belongings appeared to have been hastily gathered and removed. However, all of Harold and Margaret's original furnishings remained undisturbed, suggesting that the second family had departed with only their own minimal possessions. Most significantly, the officers found that the recently repaired section of the staircase wall had been torn open, revealing a cavity approximately 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. The opening appeared to have been created from the interior of the wall rather than from external force, with broken plaster and wooden fragments scattered on the staircase steps rather than lying within the hollow space itself. Inside this cavity, officers discovered items that would transform the missing persons investigation into something far more disturbing and psychologically complex. A collection of personal effects belonging to Harold and Margaret Kellerman, lay carefully arranged on what appeared to be a wooden shelf constructed within the wall space. Margaret's wedding ring, Harold's pocket watch, several photographs of the couple, and handwritten notes in Margaret's distinctive script were found in pristine condition, as though they had been recently placed there for safekeeping. Most unsettling was a leather-bound journal containing entries dated from March 20th through March 22, 1952, written in Margaret's handwriting but describing events that investigators could not verify or explain through any rational means. The journal entries suggested that Harold had discovered something behind the staircase wall during routine maintenance work in mid-March, something that had prompted him to seal whatever he had found within the wall structure using plaster and wooden boards acquired from the local hardware store. The journal entries provided a disturbing glimpse into the Kellermans' final days at 113 Ocean Avenue, though the events described seemed to border on the impossible. According to Margaret's writing, Harold had been investigating unusual sounds coming from within the central staircase when he discovered that a section of the interior wall was loose and could be removed to reveal a hollow space. Inside this space, he had reportedly found evidence that someone had been living within the wall structure for an extended period of time, including makeshift bedding, food containers, and personal items belonging to people who had never been residents of the house. Margaret's entries described Harold's growing obsession with sealing this discovery, his insistence that they must never speak of what lay behind the wall, and his belief that their silence was the only protection they possessed against what she termed the persistent sounds of movement, when all should be still. Margaret's final entry, dated March 22nd, described Harold's completion of the wall sealing work and his insistence that they must never again acknowledge the sounds that continued to emanate from within the sealed space. She wrote that Harold had become convinced that whatever was behind the wall was aware of their presence and was attempting to communicate with them through a series of tapping and scratching sounds that followed recognizable patterns. Most disturbing was Margaret's description of Harold's belief that the sounds were becoming more insistent and demanding, as though the source of the disturbances was growing impatient with their refusal to respond or acknowledge its presence. Her final sentences expressed growing fear that their attempts to ignore the situation were only making it worse, and that something would eventually find another way to make its presence known. County investigators brought in architectural specialists to examine the wall cavity more thoroughly and determine whether the journal entries could be verified through physical evidence. Their analysis revealed that the staircase had been constructed with an unusual interior framework that created several hollow spaces between the exterior walls and the structural support beams. These spaces were large enough to accommodate an adult person in a crouched position, though building plans filed with the township in 1934 made no reference to such compartments. The specialists determined that the hollow areas had been intentionally designed during the original construction, rather than resulting from poor workmanship or architectural oversight. This discovery raised immediate questions about why such spaces would have been included in a residential building, and whether other houses in the area had been constructed with similar hidden compartments. More disturbing was the discovery of extensive scratch marks covering the interior surfaces of the wall cavity. These markings appeared to have been made by human fingernails over an extended period of time, creating deep grooves in the wooden interior framework that suggested desperate, repeated attempts to break through the plaster and wooden barriers. The depth and pattern of the scratches indicated that whoever had created them had spent considerable time and effort trying to break free from confinement within the wall space. Chemical analysis of residue found within the scratch marks indicated the presence of organic material consistent with human tissue, though decomposition made precise identification impossible. The county coroner's office declined to issue any official determination regarding the origin of this biological evidence, citing insufficient material for conclusive analysis. Investigation of the other hollow spaces within the staircase framework revealed additional disturbing evidence that suggested the wall compartments had been used for purposes that were never documented in any official records. Several of the spaces contained makeshift furnishings, including wooden platforms that could have served as sleeping surfaces, metal containers that might have held water or food, and fabric remnants that appeared to have been used as bedding or clothing. Most significantly, investigators discovered additional handwritten materials in several of the compartments, including notes written in different handwriting styles and dating back several years. These documents suggested that multiple individuals had occupied the wall spaces at different times, possibly as hiding places during emergency situations or as temporary shelter for people who could not openly reside in the house. Some of the handwritten materials found within the wall compartments contained information that investigators found impossible to verify or explain. Several notes described events and people that did not correspond to any known residents of 113 Ocean Avenue, yet included specific details about the house's interior layout and the daily routines of families who had occupied the residence. Other notes contained what appeared to be observations of conversations and activities that had taken place within the house, written from the perspective of someone who had been listening from within the walls. These materials suggested that whoever had been using the hidden compartments had been observing and recording the activities of the house's official residents for extended periods of time. William and Dorothy Kellerman were never located, despite extensive efforts by state and federal authorities to trace their movements following their departure from Ocean Avenue. Their automobile was discovered 3 weeks later in a long-term parking area at Penn Station in Manhattan, but surveillance of train and bus departure records provided no useful information regarding their destination. The vehicle showed no signs of disturbance or struggle, and personal items left inside suggested that William and Dorothy had removed only essential belongings before abandoning the car. Like their predecessors, the second family appeared to have vanished without providing any explanation for their sudden departure or any forwarding information for future contact. Bank records indicated that they had withdrawn their savings in cash shortly before disappearing, suggesting that their departure had been planned rather than impulsive. The property remained vacant for 2 months following the discovery of the wall cavity and the second family's disappearance. During this period, neighbors reported continuing disturbances at the residence, though no one occupied the building and it remained securely locked under police supervision. Mrs. Hastings documented sounds of footsteps on the central staircase during the late evening hours, despite daily verification by patrol officers that the house remained empty and undisturbed. Other residents along Ocean Avenue began reporting similar acoustic anomalies, including the sound of someone ascending and descending the wooden steps repeatedly throughout the night. These reports were particularly disturbing because they occurred during periods when police surveillance confirmed that no unauthorized entry to the residence had taken place. Investigation of the acoustic disturbances led county authorities to consult with specialists in building acoustics and structural engineering to determine whether the hollow wall spaces could be creating unusual sound transmission effects. The specialists confirmed that the hidden compartments within the staircase framework could indeed amplify and distort sounds in unexpected ways, potentially creating the illusion of footsteps or movement when no actual activity was occurring. However, they could not explain why these acoustic effects would produce sounds that followed the specific patterns of human footsteps ascending and descending stairs, rather than random noises or echoes. Additionally, the specialist noted that the acoustic properties of the hidden compartments should have been immediately apparent to anyone living in the house, yet none of the previous residents had reported unusual echoes or sound distortions until the final weeks of their occupancy. On January 15, 1953, Nassau County authorities made the decision to seal all of the discovered wall cavities permanently using concrete rather than plaster. This work was performed by county maintenance personnel under police supervision, with the stated goal of eliminating any further acoustic disturbances that might be caused by the hidden compartments. However, the decision to use concrete rather than simpler sealing methods suggested that authorities were more concerned about preventing access to the wall spaces than merely eliminating sound transmission effects. The sealing work was completed in a single day, suggesting that authorities preferred to resolve the situation quickly rather than conduct additional investigation of the other hollow areas that building specialists had detected within the wall framework. Within 6 weeks of the concrete sealing, the property was sold through a county auction to recover taxes and maintenance expenses accumulated during the vacancy period. The successful bidder was identified as Mr. Franklin Morrison, a real estate investor from Nassau County who specialized in purchasing distressed properties for rehabilitation and resale. Mr. Morrison paid significantly below market value for the residence, though county records indicate he was fully informed of the previous occupants' unexplained disappearances and the structural modifications that had been necessary in the central staircase area. Morrison later told investigators that he believed the property's problems had resulted from poor construction and inadequate maintenance, issues that could be resolved through proper renovation work. Mr. Morrison chose not to occupy the residence personally, instead advertising it for rental to potential tenants seeking affordable housing near the Atlantic coastline. His first successful tenant was Mrs. Clara Bishop, a widow from Brooklyn who required housing following the sale of her deceased husband's business property. Mrs. Bishop moved into 113 Ocean Avenue on March 1, 1953, bringing minimal personal belongings and expressing satisfaction with the residence's proximity to public transportation and shopping facilities. She appeared to be an ideal tenant, with excellent references from previous landlords and sufficient income to maintain the property properly. Morrison felt confident that the residence's previous problems had been resolved through the structural modifications and concrete sealing work. Mrs. Bishop's tenancy began normally, with neighbors noting that she maintained regular patterns of daily activity, similar to those established by the original Kellerman family. She attended morning services at St. Joseph's Catholic Church, completed grocery shopping on Tuesday and Friday afternoons, and maintained the small garden area behind the residence that Margaret Kellerman had originally planted. Her routine was comforting to neighbors who had grown concerned about the property's history of unusual disturbances and unexplained tenant departures. For the first several weeks of her residency, Mrs. Bishop seemed to be successfully establishing the kind of stable domestic routine that had characterized the house's occupancy during the Kellermans' early years. However, by June, Mrs. Bishop's behavior had begun to change in subtle ways that initially concerned only Mrs. Hastings, who maintained the closest observation of activities at the neighboring property. Mrs. Bishop had begun spending extended periods of time on the central staircase, often sitting on the steps for hours during daylight hours. When approached by neighbors offering assistance or casual conversation, Mrs. Bishop would explain that she was listening for sounds that might indicate structural problems with the wooden steps. She expressed particular concern about the section of the staircase where the wall had been sealed with concrete, claiming that she could detect vibrations or movement behind the sealed area that suggested ongoing deterioration of the building's framework. Throughout the summer months, Mrs. Bishop's preoccupation with the staircase intensified significantly, developing into behavior patterns that neighbors found increasingly disturbing. She purchased various tools and supplies from local hardware stores, apparently intending to conduct her own investigation of the sealed wall area. Neighbors reported seeing her carrying hammers, chisels, measuring devices, and other implements into the residence, though no sounds of construction or demolition work were heard from outside the building. When questioned about her activities, Mrs. Bishop became increasingly evasive and hostile, eventually refusing to engage in conversations with neighbors or shopkeepers in the local business district. Her explanations for the tool purchases became more elaborate and less credible, involving claims about extensive maintenance work that never seemed to produce any visible results. Mrs. Bishop's isolation from the community became more pronounced as her obsession with the staircase consumed increasing amounts of her time and attention. She stopped attending church services, ceased maintaining the garden, and limited her trips to local businesses to essential purchases only. Neighbors noticed that lights in the residence remained on throughout the night, and Mrs. Bishop could occasionally be observed through windows sitting at the bottom of the central staircase, apparently listening intently to something that others could not hear. Her physical appearance began to deteriorate, suggesting that she was not maintaining proper nutrition or personal hygiene. Concerned neighbors attempted to offer assistance, but Mrs. Bishop rejected all offers of help and insisted that she was perfectly capable of managing her domestic responsibilities. On October 3, 1953, Mrs. Bishop contacted the Nassau County Building Inspector's office to request an emergency evaluation of structural damage at 113 Ocean Avenue. She claimed that the concrete ceiling work performed earlier in the year had failed and that water damage or pest infestation was causing deterioration behind the sealed wall. Her phone calls to the inspector's office became increasingly frantic, with claims that the structural damage was progressing rapidly and posed immediate safety hazards that required urgent attention. Building inspector records indicate that her initial request was denied due to lack of supporting evidence. But Mrs. Bishop's persistent phone calls, sometimes occurring multiple times per day, eventually prompted officials to schedule an inspection for October 10th to address her concerns. However, the scheduled inspection never occurred due to events that transformed Mrs. Bishop's case from a simple tenant complaint into a psychiatric emergency that required immediate intervention. On October 9, 1953, Mrs. Bishop was discovered by postal workers who had become concerned about accumulated mail at the residence and had contacted Morrison to report that his tenant appeared to have abandoned the property. When Morrison arrived with a spare key to investigate, he found Mrs. Bishop seated on the central staircase in front of the concrete sealed wall section. She appeared to have remained in that position for several days without moving to obtain food, water, or basic sanitation facilities. She was conscious but unresponsive to questions, staring directly at the sealed wall area and occasionally moving her lips as though engaged in conversation with someone who was not present. Mrs. Bishop was transported to Nassau County Hospital for medical evaluation, where her condition was assessed as severe dehydration and malnutrition, consistent with remaining motionless for approximately 4 to 5 days. Hospital staff noted that her physical symptoms were accompanied by what appeared to be complete psychological withdrawal from external reality. She responded to medical procedures, but showed no awareness of her surroundings or recognition of the medical personnel attempting to treat her condition. More concerning was her mental state during the initial 48 hours of hospitalization, when she repeatedly insisted that someone was calling her name from behind the concrete wall at the Ocean Avenue residence, and that she needed to return to the staircase to continue listening for important information that would be communicated to her through sounds transmitted through the building structure. Psychiatric evaluation conducted during Mrs. Bishop's hospitalization revealed no previous history of mental illness, delusional behavior, or psychological instability of any kind. Her medical records indicated normal psychological function throughout her adult life, with no documented episodes of depression, anxiety, or other mental health concerns that might have predisposed her to the kind of psychological breakdown she had experienced. Hospital psychiatrists found her case particularly puzzling because her delusions were highly specific and focused entirely on the Ocean Avenue residence, while her mental functioning appeared normal in all other respects. During her hospital stay, she consistently maintained that the sealed wall area contained something or someone that required her constant attention and supervision. And she described hearing rhythmic tapping or scratching sounds that she interpreted as communication attempts from an intelligent presence trapped behind the concrete barrier. Mrs. Bishop's descriptions of the sound she claimed to hear followed patterns that were remarkably similar to the acoustic disturbances reported by previous residents of 113 Ocean Avenue. She described sequences of tapping that seemed to follow a recognizable rhythm, scratching sounds that appeared to respond to her movements within the house, and what she interpreted as attempts to communicate through a primitive code based on the timing and intensity of various noises. Most disturbing to hospital staff was her insistence that the sounds had become more urgent and demanding during her final weeks at the residence, as though the source of the disturbances was growing impatient with her failure to provide an appropriate response to its communication attempts. After 10 days of hospital care and psychiatric observation, Mrs. Bishop was released to the custody of relatives from Brooklyn, who agreed to provide supervision and housing during her recovery period. Her treatment had stabilized her physical condition, but psychiatrists noted that she continued to express concern about abandoning her responsibilities at the Ocean Avenue residence. She never returned to 113 Ocean Avenue to collect her personal belongings and refused all offers of assistance in retrieving her furniture and household items from the residence. According to her relatives, she never again mentioned the Ocean Avenue property or the experiences that had led to her hospitalization, though she continued to display unusual sensitivity to certain types of sounds, particularly rhythmic tapping or scratching noises that reminded her of her experiences during her final weeks as Morrison's tenant. Mr. Morrison, faced with a third consecutive tenant abandonment and growing difficulty attracting new renters willing to occupy a property with such a disturbing history, decided to conduct his own investigation of the residence before attempting to lease it again. Local real estate professionals had advised him that the property's reputation for unusual tenant experiences was making it nearly impossible to market successfully, despite its desirable location near the Atlantic coastline. On November 13, 1953, exactly 1 year after the original disturbances had been reported by Mrs. Hastings, Morrison hired a private contractor to remove the concrete ceiling and examine the wall cavity thoroughly. This investigation was conducted without police supervision or official oversight from county authorities, as Morrison wanted to determine whether the structural modifications had been successful in eliminating the factors that had apparently contributed to previous tenants' psychological difficulties. The contractor's work revealed that the concrete had been applied over the original plaster and wooden barrier materials, rather than replacing them entirely. When these underlying materials were removed, the wall cavity appeared exactly as it had been discovered during the previous year's investigation, with no evidence of structural deterioration or water damage that might have explained Mrs. Bishop's complaints about ongoing problems behind the sealed wall. However, the contractor reported finding additional items within the hollow space that had not been documented in the original police reports. These included what appeared to be recent markings scratched into the wooden interior surfaces, despite the wall having been sealed with concrete for nearly 10 months. The scratches were similar in pattern to those discovered during the original investigation, but appeared fresher and more extensive, suggesting that whatever had created them had continued to work on enlarging and deepening the marks even after the space had been sealed. Most disturbing was the discovery of a handwritten note tucked behind one of the wooden support beams inside the cavity. The note, written on paper that appeared fresh despite the sealed environment, contained a brief message in handwriting that Morrison later identified as belonging to Mrs. Clara Bishop. The note consisted of a single sentence written in pencil on a piece of lined paper that appeared to have been torn from a standard notebook. The message read, "The sound only stops when someone is listening from outside." This note had apparently been written and placed within the wall cavity during the period when the concrete ceiling should have prevented any access to the interior space, raising questions about how Mrs. Bishop could have placed the note in its location without removing the concrete barrier. Morrison immediately ordered the wall cavity to be permanently sealed using steel plates backed with additional concrete, work that was completed the same day under his direct supervision. He then made the decision to remove the central staircase entirely and replace it with a new structure built against the opposite wall of the residence. This extensive renovation was completed during the winter months of 1953 and 1954, with the original staircase area converted into a storage closet with no access to the interior wall spaces. Morrison hoped that these major structural modifications would eliminate any remaining factors that might contribute to the psychological disturbances that had affected all previous occupants of the residence. Despite these major structural modifications, Morrison was unable to successfully rent the property for the following 2 years. Prospective tenants would often express initial interest during daytime visits, commenting favorably on the residence's size, location, and rental price. However, they would decline to sign lease agreements after spending extended periods inside the residence, particularly after viewing the area where the original staircase had been located. Several potential renters specifically mentioned feeling uncomfortable in that section of the house, describing sensations of being watched or experiencing sudden temperature changes that made them reluctant to commit to living in the residence. Morrison began to suspect that the property's reputation within the local community was making it impossible to attract tenants, regardless of any structural improvements he might implement. The property was eventually sold in 1956 to a developer who demolished the residence entirely and constructed a modern ranch-style house on the same foundation. The new construction showed no signs of the problems that had plagued the previous structure, and the developer was able to sell the completed house to a family who reported no unusual experiences during their occupancy. However, the original basement and foundation areas were left largely intact during the demolition and reconstruction process, and workers reported discovering additional hollow spaces beneath the ground floor that had not been documented in any architectural plans or county records. These basement discoveries raised questions about whether the hidden compartment construction had extended throughout the entire original structure rather than being limited to the central staircase area. The basement discoveries included several small chambers constructed within the foundation walls, similar in design to the hollow areas that had been found within the original staircase structure. Most of these spaces were empty, though workers found what appeared to be personal items dating back several decades, including clothing, photographs, and written materials that suggested the hollow areas had been used for storage purposes during the residence's early years of occupancy. Some of the discovered items appeared to belong to people who had never been official residents of 113 Ocean Avenue, though the items' condition suggested they had been stored in the basement chambers for many years. The written materials discovered in the basement chambers provided some insight into the original construction of 113 Ocean Avenue and the purpose for which the hidden compartments had been designed. Letters and receipts found among stored papers indicated that the house had been built in 1933 by a contractor named Edmund Fitzgerald, who had specialized in constructing residences with concealed storage areas during the Prohibition era. These hidden spaces had been designed to hide valuable items or illegal materials from government authorities, and were constructed using techniques that made them difficult to detect through normal building inspections or casual observation by visitors to the residence. Documentation found among Fitzgerald's papers suggested that several residences along the Long Island coastline had been built with similar hidden compartments during the early 1930s, when wealthy clients required discreet storage for valuable collections, sensitive documents, or prohibited items that could not be safely kept in conventional storage facilities. The hollow areas were typically accessed through removable panels or false walls that could be opened only by individuals familiar with their specific construction details. However, the documentation also indicated that Fitzgerald had abandoned this specialized construction practice abruptly in 1934, following what he described in a letter to business associates as client complaints regarding unexpected difficulties with some installations. The letter provided no specific details about these difficulties, but suggested that the hidden chamber designs had created unforeseen problems that made them unsuitable for continued use in residential construction. Fitzgerald's business records showed that he completed no additional hidden storage projects after 1934, instead focusing on conventional residential construction that did not include concealed compartments or specialized storage areas. This change in business focus appeared to have been prompted by specific incidents involving previous installations, though the exact nature of these incidents was not documented in any surviving records. The investigation into Fitzgerald's construction practices was conducted by Nassau County authorities during 1957 and 1958, prompted by the discovery of similar hidden chambers in 3 other residences along Ocean Avenue. In each case, these properties had experienced unexplained tenant turnovers and reports of unusual acoustic phenomena similar to those documented at 113 Ocean Avenue. However, none of the other properties had experienced the complete disappearances or severe psychological disturbances that had occurred at the original residence. Investigation of these additional properties revealed hidden compartments that were smaller and less extensively developed than those found at 113 Ocean Avenue, suggesting that the original residence had been Fitzgerald's most ambitious project involving concealed storage areas. Edmund Fitzgerald was located living in retirement in Miami, Florida, where he agreed to provide information about his construction techniques to county investigators seeking to understand the factors that had contributed to the disturbing events at 113 Ocean Avenue. His statements revealed that the hidden chamber designs had been based on architectural plans obtained from a European contractor who had specialized in similar work during the 1920s. These plans had been modified to suit American building standards and local climate conditions, but the basic design principles remained unchanged from the original European specifications, which had been developed for wealthy clients who required secure storage for valuable or sensitive materials during periods of political and economic instability. According to Fitzgerald's account, the European contractor had warned him that the hidden chamber design created acoustic properties that could cause psychological distress in certain individuals who were particularly sensitive to unusual sounds or environmental changes. The contractor had explained that the hollow spaces within wall structures could amplify and transmit sounds in unexpected ways, creating the illusion of voices or movement when no actual source for such sounds existed within the concealed areas. He had recommended that hidden chambers be constructed only in buildings that would be occupied by individuals who were aware of their presence and prepared for the acoustic effects they might produce. Fitzgerald admitted that he had not shared this warning with his clients, believing that the acoustic properties were merely an inconvenience rather than a serious concern that could affect residents' psychological well-being. He had also failed to provide clients with detailed information about the location and access methods for hidden chambers within their residences. Assuming that property owners would maintain records of these features independently and share the information with future occupants as necessary. This oversight meant that subsequent occupants of these residences, including renters and family members who inherited the properties, remained unaware of the hidden chambers and their potential acoustic effects. The Nassau County investigation concluded that the unexplained disappearances and psychological disturbances at 113 Ocean Avenue had resulted from the combination of hidden chamber acoustics and the psychological stress experienced by occupants who could not identify the source of unusual sounds within their residence. The official report, filed in March 1959, attributed the incidents to environmental factors rather than criminal activity or supernatural phenomena. Though investigators acknowledged that several aspects of the case remained unexplained despite extensive investigation by multiple agencies and specialists. However, several aspects of the case remained troubling to investigators and could not be adequately explained by the official conclusions. The personal belongings discovered within the wall cavity had never been satisfactorily accounted for, particularly the items that appeared to have been placed there after the chambers had been sealed with concrete. The handwritten materials found at various stages of the investigation contained information that could not have been known by the individuals who supposedly authored them, including details about the chamber construction and architectural history that were not discovered until years later during the investigation of Fitzgerald's construction practices. Most significantly, the investigation failed to explain the complete disappearances of Harold and Margaret Kellerman, followed by William and Dorothy Kellerman. While the official report suggested that these individuals had chosen to leave their residences due to psychological distress caused by acoustic phenomena, no evidence supported this conclusion. None of the missing persons had contacted relatives, accessed bank accounts, or been located in any other geographic area despite extensive searches conducted by state and federal authorities using resources typically reserved for cases involving suspected criminal activity. The case files for 113 Ocean Avenue were sealed by Nassau County authorities in 1960, with access restricted to law enforcement personnel and academic researchers studying similar unexplained phenomena. The decision to seal the files was made despite requests from several universities and research institutions that had expressed interest in studying the psychological and acoustic factors that had contributed to the disturbing events at the residence. The property itself has remained in private ownership since 1956, with the modern ranch-style house showing no signs of the problems that affected the original structure. Current residents report no unusual acoustic phenomena or structural concerns related to the underlying foundation and basement areas that were retained from the original construction. Yet, Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, who continued to reside at 111 Ocean Avenue until her death in 1967, maintained detailed private records of ongoing disturbances at the neighboring property throughout the 1960s. Her personal journals, discovered among her effects following her death, documented regular occurrences of unexplained sounds originating from the basement area of the modern house, particularly during the late evening hours when the current occupants were presumably asleep. These records suggest that whatever factors contributed to the original disturbances at 113 Ocean Avenue may have persisted despite the complete reconstruction of the residence above ground level. Mrs. Hastings' journals describe acoustic phenomena that were remarkably similar to those reported by previous residents of the original structure, including rhythmic tapping sounds, scratching noises that seemed to emanate from within the walls, and what she interpreted as footsteps moving through areas of the basement that should have been inaccessible to human occupation. However, the current property owners have reported no awareness of unusual phenomena, and neighborhood residents have not filed any official complaints regarding disturbances since 1956, suggesting that the acoustic effects may be detectable only by individuals who maintain prolonged observation of the property from adjacent locations. The story of 113 Ocean Avenue serves as a reminder that human psychological resilience has limits that cannot always be predicted or understood through conventional analysis. The intersection of environmental factors, architectural design, and individual psychological sensitivity can create conditions that challenge our understanding of normal domestic life and the boundaries between rational and irrational fear. Sometimes the walls that surround our daily lives conceal more than we realize, and the sounds we dismiss as ordinary settling or expansion may carry messages that some individuals are uniquely positioned to receive and interpret. In the end, perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case is not what was discovered within the sealed chambers of 113 Ocean Avenue, but rather what remains hidden in similar spaces beneath our feet and within our walls, waiting patiently for someone to listen carefully enough to hear the persistent whispers that echo through the hollow places where secrets are kept. The case reminds us that the homes we consider safe and familiar may contain mysteries that previous occupants chose to seal away rather than confront, and that some doors, once closed, may be better left unopened forever. And perhaps in the end, the greatest horror lies not in what we might discover, but in the knowledge that we are never truly alone in the spaces we call home.